Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about rebuilding Europe. And we're going to look at it in two sections in this lecture. We're going to look at it from rebuilding from 1945 after World War II to 1985, and then from 1985 to 2001. Now, we've already talked about the situation in Europe at the end of World War II, and it was dire for most countries. Germany and much of Eastern Europe was devastated. Nearly every country in Europe had to reestablish a working government, and economies were in shambles. Now, refugees flooded roads and detention camps, as did demobilized or surrendered soldiers. Former prisoners, concentration camp victims, and Axis soldiers spent months, even years, in such camps. And there was a mass immigration of millions of Germans who fled East Prussia, now Poland, ahead of the Red Army, were expelled from the Sudetenland and other areas occupied by the Reich. Jews, many from families broken by the Holocaust, tried to flee to Palestine or America. The British, concerned about the Arab reaction, mainly because of oil, tried to stem the flood to Palestine by interdicting ships and interning refugees in camps. By 1948, radical Jewish terrorism drove the British out of Palestine, and the United Nations offered a plan to divide the region into two states, Israel for the Jews and Jordan for the Palestinians, with Jerusalem an international city. Now, an Arab rejection of this plan resulted in a bloody war for Israel's independence in 1948 and 49, and the displacement of more than 700,000 Arabs, laying the ground for the next half-century of resentment and bloodshed. Now, socialism, as we've spoken about in many lectures, was embraced in the East and West, but the latter variety remained democratic. Now, as we've seen, the countries of Eastern Europe were forced to accept communist regimes after the war. Land and property were confiscated by the state, and economic policy for the whole Eastern Bloc was coordinated by the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon. Now, the Soviets retarded economic development by insisting that satellite states pay massive reparations. Eastern Bloc countries established welfare states with centrally planned economies, providing minimal levels of health care and education, as well as guaranteed full involvement for their citizens. Following on the heels of World War II, this created a sense of dependence on the state that became almost an article of faith in the East, but a countervailing sense that the state was an overwhelming entity with no concern for the individual, and this bred cynicism as well. Now, in Western Europe, the democracies also embraced socialism. The individual nations of Western Europe had a long history of wide disparities of wealth that had been exacerbated by the Depression. And the Depression had convinced many Europeans that untrammeled capitalism did not work, while planned economics had won the war. Thus, in Britain, France, and elsewhere, people voted overwhelmingly in 1945, 46, and 47 to return governments that would construct welfare states. Now, building the welfare state was made difficult by the fact that goods were in short supply. Now, rationing continued in some European countries into the early 1950s. Thanks in part to the Marshall Plan and rearmament, prosperity gradually came to Western Europe in the 50s and 60s. West Germany in particular recovered. The German government and people attempted to confront the Nazi past, and German industry reassured a leadership position under Ludwig Erhard's social market economy. Now, the presence of U.S. troops allowed the governments of Western Europe to keep defense expenditures low and pour money into social programs. The Marshall Plan, followed by the establishment of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, established the precedent of European states working together economically. In 1957, the European Economic Community, or the EEC, or Common Market, established a free trade area within Europe. Charles de Gaulle, French premier and president from 1958 to 1969, was one of the principal architects of the EEC. He had a vision of a loose federated Europe stretching from Russia to the Atlantic Ocean, independent of the superpowers. At the same time that he wanted a stronger Europe, de Gaulle also wanted something contradictory: to maintain French independence. Now, in 1967, the Common Market joined with the European Steel and Coal Community and the European Atomic Energy Commission to form the European Community, or EC. Throughout the 70s and 80s, the EC concentrated on economic integration and continued to add members, and by the 70s, the EC was the world's largest trading unit. Now, the material conditions of life improved in Western Europe, but the oil crisis of 1973 and the recession of the early 1980s were major setbacks. The European government on the right and left began to cut social programs. Now, in the early 70s, the Western and communist powers sought to thaw the Cold War in a process called détente. In 1972, U.S. President Richard Nixon opened relations with China and signed an anti-ballistic missile treaty with the Brezhnev government in the Soviet Union. Subsequently, the superpowers considered limiting the number of nuclear weapons at the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, also known as SALT I. Now, this moment of sanity fell apart at the end of the 70s with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, beginning around 1980, the Western democracies experienced a move back to conservative social and economic policy under Margaret Thatcher in the UK, Ronald Reagan in the US, and Helmut Kohl in Germany. Now, to some extent, this move was a reaction to a reheated Cold War after 1979. It also marked a serious questioning of the sustainability of the welfare state. In Britain, especially national transportation and utility companies were privatized, failing industries were allowed to die, and government spending and benefits were cut. This activity led to a prosperity that was mainly enjoyed by those at the top and middle of the social pyramid. Those who lost jobs in heavy industry experienced a painful adjustment. Everywhere, unemployment bred discontent. Radical and separatist movements sometimes resorted to terrorism. Beginning in 1968, Basque nationalists have waged a campaign for independence from Spain. Also in 1968, the Troubles erupted in Northern Ireland, leading a revised Irish Republican army to begin a terror campaign to drive the British out. In Germany and Italy, terrorist organizations favored communism and/or the establishment of a Palestinian state. For the 1980s, conservative groups embraced xenophobia, opposed immigration, and sought to win at the ballot box. Now, cultural change was made both possible and inevitable by the material conditions created in post-war Europe. The war and the Holocaust, combined with the historical record of state churches, did much to further weaken the hold of institutional religions on people's lives. Booming scientific discovery seemed to offer an alternative worldview. Better nutrition and the discovery of vaccines for such diseases as polio increased life expectancy. Following the launching of the first satellite, Sputnik, the Soviets and the West engaged in an expensive scientific competition. Technology continued to advance, making existing products, automobiles, communication technology, better while creating new ones, including the personal computer. Existentialism, first associated with Soren Kierkegaard, emphasized the idea that man was alone in the universe, free but alienated from society. In philosophy, the movement was led by Jean-Paul Sartre, in literature by Albert Camus. Related to existentialism were structuralist and deconstructionist movements in academia that questioned the traditional primacy of empirical fact. Now, feminism increasingly questioned old gender roles, and Europe experienced a continuing sexual revolution. Now, while mass culture was manufactured in the West by multinational companies, Eastern Bloc arts remained strictly controlled by the state. Now, Western Europe saw an anti-American backlash. The generation that grew up thinking of Americans as allies and liberators began to give way in the 80s to one that saw them as just another imperialist power. In the 1960s, a growing youth culture, particularly among university students, produced a counterculture on both sides of the Atlantic that questioned old assumptions about nationalism and patriotism. The Vietnam War and American involvement in Central and South America and the Middle East in the 60s through the 80s caused many Europeans to see American foreign policy as self-serving and hypocritical. Now, this view would eventually lead to a growing sense that European and American interests were not identical. Now, the decline of the Soviet Union was unexpected in the West. The first hints of change in the Soviet Union came after the death of Stalin in 1953 and Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, which attacked Stalin and his cult of personality. Now, Nikita Khrushchev, General Secretary from 1953 and Soviet Premier from 58 to 64, was a bundle of contradictions. He crushed a Hungarian attempt to create a more open society by sending in tanks in 1956, and the death toll has been put as high as 20,000. He promised to surpass the Western standard of living by 1980, but the Soviet economy continued to perform miserably. He alternated between confrontation and peaceful coexistence with the West. He built the Berlin Wall. He allied with Syria, Egypt, and India. He placed missiles in Cuba, but stood down in 1962. And he worked out test ban treaties with President Kennedy in 1963. In October of 1964, Khrushchev was overthrown in a coup by hardliners led by Leonid Brezhnev. At home and in satellite country, Brezhnev clamped down on criticism and dissidents, crushing the Prague Spring in 1968. In the 70s, he pursued détente but abandoned it at the end of that decade. The Soviet Union was losing its grip as satellite countries began to pursue their own forms of communism. Other Eastern Bloc economies found ways to trade with the West and were leaving the Soviets behind. And increasingly, neither Bucharest nor Belgrade listened to Moscow. Above all, the Soviets' economy stagnated. By the time of Brezhnev's death in 1982, it was evident to some in high Soviet circles that repressive policies at home and aggressive confrontations from the U.S. were not sustainable. The failure to defeat the Muslim insurgents in Afghanistan showed chinks in the Soviet military system. And simultaneously in the 80s, the Reagan defense buildup put increasing pressure on the Soviets to keep up. Now, over the objections of U.S. liberals who wanted a more conciliatory policy, President Reagan proposed and Congress authorized massive military spending. Included was money for research on the Strategic Defense Initiative, a plan to create a shield of anti-missile devices around the United States and its allies to make a first strike impossible. Now, President Reagan's public announcement about the Strategic Defense Initiative on the 23rd of March 1983 was hopelessly premature. The science and technology simply did not exist, but the Soviets did not know that. Reagan's bold rhetoric added to the sense of growing tension. Critics have argued that his comments increased Kremlin paranoia, creating a mindset that led to such incidents as the shooting down of a Korean airliner that strayed into Soviet airspace in September of '83. But it must be said that overall, Reagan's rhetoric was no harsher than that of the Soviets with regard to democratic capitalism and its imperialistic American sponsors. Reagan's defense buildup was a form of brinksmanship, but it would never have been enough to undermine the Soviet state. In the end, only a Soviet leader could end the Cold War, or the Soviet Union itself. Now, after the brief regimes of Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet premier in 1985. A committed communist, Gorbachev nevertheless saw that the current Soviet system was unsustainable. He launched a major reform called Perestroika and designed to save communism by making it more open, or glasnost. Now, political prisoners were released, free expression and freedom of assembly were allowed, and political parties other than the Communist Party were permitted. Now, Gorbachev also began to work with the Reagan administration to ease the international situation, especially in the area of nuclear weapons. Gorbachev was the first Soviet leader to realize that the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc could never be secure if the US and Western Bloc were not. Now, in 1987, the US and the Soviet Union agreed to the IMF Treaty, eliminated nuclear weapons deployed in the 1970s. In 1988, Gorbachev proposed a massive reduction of conventional forces and ordered Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. Now, perestroika faced unsurmountable obstacles in an economy organized around an arms race and one that had trained its citizens to rely on the government for their economic well-being. Glasnost allowed oppositions to develop in previously one-party states in the Eastern Bloc. Now, crucially, in 1989, Gorbachev did not crack down on when, first, the Warsaw Pact, then the Soviet Union itself began to break up. Rather, he announced that the Brezhnev Doctrine, the use of force to keep satellite states in line with the Soviet Union, was dead. It was replaced by the principle that former states could now go their own way. Now, additionally, this remarkable year did not begin well. On the 9th of April, Soviet troops fired on and killed 20 peaceful demonstrators in Tbilisi Square in Georgia. But beginning on the 2nd of May, Hungarians trying to immigrate to the West were allowed through. And throughout the summer and fall, the satellite states experienced newfound freedoms. In Poland, the trade union Solidarity won an election and joined a coalition government in November. The Berlin Wall came down. The only massive bloodshed occurred in Romania, where Nicolae Cușcu ordered the massacre of 4,000 protesters on the 17th of December. A few days later, he was deposed, and he and his wife were executed. Now, in the Soviet Union itself, on the 7th of February 1990, the General Committee of the Communist Party agreed to give up its monopoly on power. Gorbachev tried to turn himself into a democratically elected leader and hold onto a federal system with the constituent republics of the former Soviet Union, but these republics wanted independence. Early in 1991, the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, seceded. On the 7th and the 8th of December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine announced their independence, and with it, the formal end of the Soviet Union. Now, as an afterthought, Gorbachev resigned as the first and last president of the Soviet Union on Christmas Day. Now, Russia, under President Boris Yeltsin, persuaded most of the former constituent republics to form the Commonwealth of Independent States. Now, the breakup of the Eastern Bloc changed the balance of power again and raised questions around the world. How far and how fast could or should the countries of the Eastern Bloc embrace democracy and capitalism? How far and how fast should they be integrated into the West? And what would be the roles of Russia and the US in the new Europe and the world? Finally, what was Europe's role in a world that was no longer bipolar? Now, following the breakup of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, democracy flourished in Poland, Hungary, Slovenia, and the Baltic states. Czechoslovakia broke peacefully into two democracies, the Czech Republic and Slovenia, and Yugoslavia also broke up, but more violently. Now, East and West Germany were reunited, with serious material and psychological disruptions on both sides. East Germans experienced housing shortages, hundreds of thousands lost their jobs, crime rose, and with it a sense of disorientation as the East German press disappeared overnight. West Germans resented the economic burdens of integration, including higher taxes and budget cuts in their own social services to take care of the East Germans. But the good news was that in 1994, the last Russian and American troops left Berlin, officially closing the books on World War II. Democracy had more difficulty in Romania, Slovakia, Bulgaria, the Ukraine, and Russia. Following an attempted communist restoration in 1991, Russian democracy continued to struggle against corruption, poverty, and gang warfare. Russia remained a great nuclear power, as did Ukraine, but because of their dire economic situation, their respective nuclear arsenals suffered from poor maintenance and security and demoralized troops. Now, as for Russia's economy, Yeltsin opted for a quick embrace of capitalism, which caused much hardship. Despite massive Western loans, inflation wiped out salaries and savings, and healthcare and social services collapsed. Other Eastern Bloc countries suffered similarly at first. Across the East, price controls and subsidies were abolished. Food and fuel costs skyrocketed, obsolete state factories and businesses closed, producing 15% unemployment. Overall, economic activity plunged by 1/3. Now, some electorates turned back to communist parties, but there was no revival of totalitarianism. By 1995, the situation was looking up. Against Russia's wishes, some former Soviet allies, including Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, sought to join NATO in 1999. Others have joined the European Economic Community, which changed its name in 1994 to the European Union, or the EU. Now, if the Cold War was really over, who had won? Now, the democratic capitalism that appeared to have triumphed decisively over communism. There remained a few holdouts, including China, North Korea, and Cuba. Communist parties remained active in most European countries and elsewhere. And in Europe and in the former Commonwealth countries, democratic capitalism was tempered by socialism. Now, throughout the 90s, as economies began to boom, in part because of free trade and in part because of the internet, European markets received far greater benefits and more vacation time than their American counterparts as a result of this socialist slant. Now, this situation raised another question. If communism lost, what won? Now, democracy certainly, and capitalism, but what kind of capitalism? In the US, free market capitalism has produced an affluent society, but one that increasingly complains of overwork and a growing disparity between rich and poor. Now, perhaps it's appropriate to say that while totalitarian communism clearly lost to democracy as a political system, the jury is still out on what complementary socioeconomic system will eventually be declared the winner. Now, although the end of the Soviet Union threat was good news in the capitals of Europe, it also presented a difficulty. Now, how could Europe count if there was no longer a second superpower competing for its loyalty? Would those states call for withdrawal of U.S. troops? And if so, would they have to spend money on their own defense? Would the EU assume collective political and foreign policy authority as a counterweight to the U.S.? The coalition organized by President George Bush against the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990 through 91 included many European nations. Now, victory in the Persian Gulf War, followed by sanctions on Iraq, demonstrated that Europe could follow an American lead in areas beyond its shores in pursuit of common interests. But could Europe solve an international problem without American help? The opportunity to do so came in the early 90s in the Balkans. In 91 through 92, a new Balkan crisis arose. In 1918, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia had been created out of Serbia, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Macedonia. Following World War II, Marshal Tito had recreated Yugoslavia as a communist state, taking an independent line from Moscow. Yugoslavia traded with the West, which put it in a perfect position to capitalize on the events of the late 20th century. Now, Tito died in 1980, and the six constituent republics of Yugoslavia began to angle for independence and territory. In 1992, the Republic of Serbia, headed by Slobodan Milosevic, proclaimed a new Yugoslavia, including Montenegro, and began to encourage Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia to bring those states under Serb control. Bloody civil war broke out among Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croatians, and Bosnian Muslims. Local minorities were often forced out of their homes, banished, or killed in a process referred to as ethnic cleansing. Now, at first, European reaction was weak condemnation. Europe seemed incapable of acting in concert to end the violence. As in the 30s, the last war had made Europeans understandably gun-shy. Western Europe also feared the reaction of Russia, which had resumed its traditional role as the protector of the Serbs. Finally, despite increasing economic integration, there was little experience of European-wide military cooperation. Ethnic cleansing was condemned by the UN, which sent peacekeeping forces, and periodic ceasefires were negotiated, then violated, and UN safe havens were repeatedly attacked. It was not until the U.S. under President Bill Clinton involved itself that any results were achieved. Clinton's government pressured the Serbs with economic sanctions endorsed by the EU, and by 1995, NATO bombing campaigns married to a Croatian offensive drove the Serbs back. That year, Milosevic signaled his willingness to cooperate. Now, the U.S. brokered the Dayton Accords, which imposed an uneasy peace supervised by NATO forces in Bosnia. Now, the resultant shaky peace was broken in 1999 when Milosevic sought to crush a movement for autonomy among Islamic ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. Russia paralyzed the United Nations by threatening to veto any Security Council action against Serbia. NATO, led by the U.S., launched a massive and controversial bombing campaign against Serbia. And this campaign halted the bloodshed and brought the Milosevic regime down. Now, NATO peacekeeping forces remained in Kosovo through the end of the century. The European failure to solve or even to act decisively in the Balkans crisis suggests that Europe has a long way to go to achieve a federal union. Now, still, as the 20th century came to a close, there was much optimism about the future of Europe. The West had enjoyed unprecedented prosperity in the 90s. If the fall of the Soviet Union marked the end of history, then the extended prosperity of the 90s possibly marked the end of economics, or at least of boom and bust cycles. Multinational European cooperations, such as Airbus, taking advantage of free trade within Europe and supported by generous government subsidies, began to compete seriously with American industrial giants such as Boeing. Eastern Europe was moving rapidly towards integration with the West, both economically and politically. The internet, email, and similar developments were breaking down communication barriers and providing greater individual freedom of expression. Now, relatively open borders, generous welfare states, and the prosperity of the 1990s had attracted huge numbers of immigrants to Europe, many of them from the Middle East. The EU expanded to 25 countries, and in 1993, its member states signed the Treaty of Maastricht, setting the goals of one currency and political unity. In reaction to Kosovo, the Helsinki Summit of 1999, members pledged to create a rapid reaction force to supplement the U.S. peacekeeping mission. There was increased cooperation in law enforcement, and the EU also began to draw up a constitution to be approved by referenda in all constituent countries. Now, finally, European-American diplomacy operated consensually and, for the most part, smoothly. Now, most of these hopes, though, had corresponding fears. As the century turned, the Western economy suffered a downturn when internet stocks were forced to be overvalued. The resultant need for government spending cuts raised the question of whether the European welfare states could be sustained any longer. Calls for greater European involvement in global peacekeeping implied greater and more expensive defense establishments. Subsidies for Eastern agriculture and industry threatened to provoke trade war with the United States. And while Eastern Europe moved politically, socially, and culturally west, Russia cast about for its new role. Russian democracy often seemed to be held hostage to rival gains and special interests. The election of former KGB agent Vladimir Putin as president in 2000 raised the question of whether Russia had truly abandoned its autocratic past. Now, Russia's poorly maintained nuclear arsenal represented a potentially de-establishing force. In 1985, rebels in the predominantly Muslim province of Chechnya sought to break away. This led the Russian government to pursue harsh reprisals that led in turn to Chechnya acts of terrorism in Russia itself. Now, the internet was found to be vulnerable to computer hacking, which might paralyze economic and defense systems. And some of Europe's recent immigrants, especially those from Islamic states in the Middle East, rejected Western culture as decadent and profane. A tiny fringe from this group had been sympathetic to Osama bin Laden's call for a worldwide anti-Western jihad. Now, the possibility of integration into a European Union was rejected by nationalists in many countries, and Europeans continued to feel as if they were junior partners to their alliance with the US. Now, whatever threats there were to European security at the end of our course, they came, for the most part, from outside. Europeans finally seemed to have learned to get along with each other without armed conflict, and most European states guaranteed a full array of civil rights while providing the highest standards of living. Now, is it possible that modern Europeans have finally become fully civilized?